Well, good evening, or good afternoon, or good morning to you all, depending on whereabouts on the world you currently are. And welcome to this panel on the art of pacing, keeping players scared and engaged, structuring tension and climaxes in horror games, which is a subject very dear to my own heart. I am your moderator, Mike, sometimes known as Mr. Spike. My pronouns are he, him, and as well as turning up like a bad penny in various actual play podcasts, I read weird tales on my podcast, Mr. Spike's Bedtime Stories. Now, before we dive into the introductions and discussions, a couple of quick reminders. This panel is being streamed live and recorded for future viewing on the Weekend with Good Friends YouTube channel. Please feel free to drop any questions into the stream as we go along, and our lovely producers, Miranda, I'm looking at you, will give us a heads up in case we miss anything. We expect everyone, viewers, listeners, and panelists, and even me, to respect the convention's code of conduct. Please treat each other with kindness and respect. We are all here to enjoy great conversations and the hobby that we love. And now, it gives me very great pleasure to introduce our amazing lineup of panelists today. In fact, now, why don't we let them introduce themselves? Why don't you tell the viewers and listeners who you are and what you're up to? Let's start with Rina.
Hi all, I'm Rina. My pronouns are they, them. I am a podcaster, primarily with the Old Ways podcast and Ain't Slayed Nobody, but you can find me on a bunch of other places. I write Call of Cthulhu scenarios, and I hang around the Discord quite a bit. Quite a bit.
Thank you, Rina. And moving round the table, let's introduce Lydia.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lydia, and it's great to be here at a weekend with good friends. Thank you so much for having me. I've been a Call of Cthulhu podcaster for some years now, and I co-manage the actual play podcast, Lightless Beacons. You can also find me at the Miskatonic Playhouse.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lydia. And last, very definitely not least, Kat, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Kat. My pronouns are she, her, and I occasionally guest star as a guest player on Ain't Slayed Nobody. And I have been in the Alien mini series as well for the How We Roll podcast. I do also occasionally stream art over at Acantha_arts on Twitch as well.
And welcome, Kat. Welcome all. Let's start off, shall we, with a question for everyone. Well, maybe we'll start with Lydia. What is a moment in a game that you've either run or played that you think or you feel has perfectly captured the kind of pacing that you strive for in horror?
Well, for me, that has to be the amazing experience of having Aurora Blue run by Bridget Jeffries, the legend. Right from the beginning, before we started recording, she laid out her expectations about how it was going to go. She said it's going to be 90 minutes of play and we're going to go fast, fast, fast. And in the best possible way, it was absolutely relentless. Not a moment to breathe, which is quite appropriate, really. I mean, you consider that the book it comes from is called No Time to Scream. There was definitely no time to scream. But I think what made it so special was that with that speed and with that pressure, the story is built in a way that it's interrupted with some flashbacks. And these are each investigator, they're solo, and they have a much more meditative tone. And it develops the investigators' backstories. So they're quite introspective, they're quite internalized. And then they also give depth, a real personal depth to the other big theme of the scenario, which is the historical racism experienced by the investigators, who are all Black or Indigenous people. So that sudden change of pace, and that also created a change of mood, and those contrasts, that duality, I think it really underscored the intensity of both what was happening in the main plot and the experiences that the investigators have gone through in their past. So I think where you might expect to have that sort of conventional build of tension, and then a release, like a wave breaking. Instead of that, it was a shift. It was a shift to a completely different type of tension, which was, again, much more introspective and internal rather than what's happening in the main plot of the scenario. So moving from that outward story to the inward story, it was something very different, and it demanded a completely different headspace, but it was a totally different kind of pacing, and it was a very, very special game to be a part of for me.
That's wonderful. I have yet to experience that particular game. It's something I
Oh,
look
do
forward
it.
to
Definitely do
very,
it.
very much if I can at some point.
I played that one
Kat,
last night at the con. It was very good. And
Oh, wow.
the tension and the pacing on it, just the way Bridget has structured it is just
Hmm.
absolutely masterful. Whether
Yeah,
you're playing it as a
it is.
1 hour game or 4 hours, which is how we did it, highly recommend.
Yeah, and I imagine it was such a different sort of experience because, of course, I played it for a podcast for Lightless Beacons, but at a con where you don't know the people and being thrown into that very sort of intimate kind of scenario in a way that, and having to really dig deep, that must have been a really, really fascinating experience.
Great. So, Rina, while we're speaking to you about this, are there any other games that you've either run yourself or played in that you think picked up on that pacing well?
So I think going off something I've run would be for running Friends of Dorothy, my LGBTQ 1980s scenario for Symphony Entertainment. Friends of Dorothy doesn't do the typical like build up to a climax, and then you have the come down or a multiple high climaxes. It's very much a softer sort of, you have small horrors along the way and you don't necessarily build up to a huge reveal at the end kind of scenario. It's a very different type of pacing for me. It was a big experiment for me when I was writing it, and running it for Symphony, which just incredible cast of people over there, just amazing role players, and taking each of those individual things that they encountered and making it sort of a mini climax. Like this is a moment of realization. You're playing queer characters and you're dealing with these horrors, but you're also having this kind of understanding of yourself or of things that you've been through or that you are going through. So kind of a bit similar to what Lydia was describing with Aurora Blue is kind of something I was going for. And just it was partially the way I was managing it, partially also the way the characters, the players were taking in they were building their own tension as well with building in the character moments from their backstories and their queerness and their understanding of their queerness in regards to the horrors that they were facing. And so they would come up against each of these and they would play into, well, this is a moment of homophobia I've experienced in my life that relates to something that is happening here. And they would play into it and build it up, and then give me the rein to build that tension and build it up even higher for them individually, not necessarily for the group each time, but the individual tension, the individual pacing, the individual climax. It was just a really powerful experience, and it, like I said, it's a completely different method of pacing than I've used or played before, and it's something that has stuck with me ever since I ran that particular iteration of it.
Great. And what about you, Kat? We've spoken already about a couple of specifically Call of Cthulhu horror scenarios. How do you find maybe that Call of Cthulhu differs from other horror games, or is there any game that you've been involved in that you've felt has absolutely nailed it spot on in terms of pacing?
I'm just thinking of Alien, the Alien role play game, because it's very much built on that the token kind of, we're going to build this very, very slowly, and we're going to really start introducing these little concepts quite. It's quite kind of a lengthy period of time that you kind of bring in that horror, so it does draw on that almost very cinematic, looking down a corridor very slowly, and maybe there's something there but maybe not. when we played the one that we did for How We Roll, we had a game master called John Hook who really knew how to pace that game so that tension was being built. But it starts off with your cryotubes on fire and the alarms going, and you have to make decisions. So there's that kind of opening shock, and then that kind of throws you in, gets you really hooked in and engaged. And then it's that slow build, exploring ships, kind of not really knowing what's going on. And I think it's that really good example of how you can use almost cinema to kind of really influence how you run a game, and almost hitting those cinematic beats. And although they're a little bit cliche because, you know, they're used all the time, it's a good example of how, even though it's something that's done often, it still can be done really, really well. And even though you know something's coming, we know the alien, we know how these films go, you can still have a really tense, really almost kind of a really good horror experience, even though you know kind of what's coming, because you can still build that really long tension and kind of do it that way. So I probably would say it's one of my favorite ones. That's probably non-Call of Cthulhu.
So, was that a shorter form one-shot game, or was that an extended over multiple sessions game?
So that one was extended over multiple sessions, so it was kind of several sessions, but it was almost like one day, which made it really interesting because you're playing out this kind of whole day over a long period of time, and it feels like sometimes that could be a bit much, but it worked really well with how that story was laid out, how the tension was built really, really slowly, and it kept us engaged the whole way through.
Fantastic. And I suppose that sort of brings me on to another question, which is really to do with the difference between one-shots, maybe like short form convention games, or even one-shots that cover a couple of sessions, and longer form games like full-blown campaigns that may last many tens or even 20s of sessions. And anyone, please feel free to jump in at any time. How do you feel that pacing, maybe if you're running a game, or even if you're acting as a player in a game, how do you feel that pacing would differ between a shorter one-shot game and these much longer games with a lot which have a lot more to them and last over many sessions? Kat, why don't we just start with you, since you were talking about Alien there, a slightly longer one.
No, yeah. So I find that with one shots, pacing sometimes for me can go a little bit out the window. Sometimes I intend to run something that's supposed to be 3 hours and I finish it in about 2, or I end up needing 4. And I do find that I find it quite difficult to run a short game, because I find that that's when my pacing goes a bit wibbly. What I would say is, don't worry too much about your time frame. If you're sort of saying it's going to be kind of 3 hours, have a start and an end. And when I say don't worry about your time frame, that wasn't what I meant. What I meant was, don't worry about trying to shove everything in to your time frame. So if you've got a scenario and it's got 7 scenes in there, you don't have to run every scene. So with the short games, it's sometimes saying, actually, can I take this out? Can I shift this around? And almost play with it a little bit. And I find that with the shorter games, you sometimes have to kind of almost cut content, or kill your darlings, I think is the phrase. Whereas with a longer campaign, maybe you can explore some of these areas a little bit more, with a little, and spend a bit more time in one of the rooms, or spend a little bit more time giving the players loads and loads of letters or props to really read through. But with the shorter games, I think you've got to be really careful with what you're actually giving, because you could sometimes give someone a letter and they might spend 2 minutes reading it and be like, as we've got the info, or they might spend an hour discussing this one letter. So you also have to think about your players, because some players will be quite quick and some players won't. So I think it depends on your group when you're running a short session or a long session. It also depends on what you're running. Don't be afraid to just pull stuff out. But I have found that you can, I would say with a shorter session, I tend to punch action a bit heavier, Whereas with a longer scenario, I feel like I can build a real sense of dread a lot more. That's not to say you can't have a sense of dread in a short game, but I do find that I tend to put a bit more action in a short game than in perhaps in a longer campaign.
And what about Lydia or Rina? Rina, I know that we have been in quite a long campaign together.
Yes.
How do you feel that the pacing in something like the Horror on the Orient Express would differ from, for the sake of argument, the Aurora Blue or Friends of Dorothy?
So you have a lot more breathing room in a campaign. If you have a session where people mostly just talk, figuring out clues, puzzling things together, that can work really well in a campaign because you have this feeling of people taking their time. It unless maybe you're doing something super high octane like two-headed serpent or whatever, where you're just going bang 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 place to place. But in general, you have that downtime, or you have the space for, all right, all the player characters are getting together to talk about these letters they've read, or to plan out their next steps, or to look at timetables for trains, whatever it is they want to do in a campaign. You can have some of those, and it's not going to completely derail you, right? And it also can add more to the character, to the characterization, to who they are. It lets you develop those relationships, the antagonism or the friendship between the PCs, and so on. So it builds the momentum in character ways, not just plot ways. Whereas in a one shot or a two shot, depending on how long you're taking for something, you don't have a whole lot of time for that. Like, I find myself when I'm running one shots, I don't do a lot of handouts in my games. Very rarely will you find a handout in arena game, um, because people tend to obsess over them in a lot of groups, like picking out the little details or the exact phrasing of this one sentence, or can you tell me about the ink that was written on this paper? What year was the ink from? Can I do a sniff test to figure out what country the ink came from or whatever? Um, so you have to be able to manage things like that more, because you can't let them sit around for 90 minutes talking about this one handout. And you don't have the time to take an entire session for a planning episode. So you have to be able to find the things that you can cut, or the places where you're nudging, like, okay, you've been talking in game or in character about this for 90 minutes. It's been 20 minutes in the game. We need to move on. Like, you have to come up with something like the cops invade, or you get a phone call, or the house is suddenly on fire, rocks fall, whatever it is, to get people to move, where you don't necessarily have to do that quite as much in a campaign, I find.
Right. What about yourself, Lydia? What campaigns have you been involved in that you've
Well, I before I answer, I'm just going to say, Rena, I love the thing about the handouts, because I have also faced that, where somebody was uh, quite confused about the handwriting on a particular handout. It's, well, that doesn't look like the handwriting of that NPC. Why is that? And the answer is because that's the font Chaosium had in their thing. So I love that, and I sympathize. But yes, in terms of the difference between the one shots and the campaigns, for me, with the bigger campaigns or the much longer stories, especially the globe-trotting ones, I like to give players a little holiday. I like to give them something nice to do, or something nice to visit right after there's been a big plot development or a big scare, just to sort of let them have a moment to calm and to breathe a bit. Maybe it's, as Rena was saying, a time to look at the clues and to review, everything that they've learned so far, but also just a chance to have those character interactions and relationship building for the characters. But that does require time, as Rena said. So when it's a one shot, I like to do the same thing, but to put it before the big scares, if I know something big is coming up, and to reflect the setting as well. So if it's a Regency game, tell us about what gown you're wearing to the ball. What does it look like? What color is it? How are you doing your hair? If it's the classic 20s setting, what drink are you ordering at the speakeasy? What sort of music is being played? what's the singer on stage singing? How are you enjoying yourself? To just sort of give them a little break and a chance to before the fishmen come in and eat everybody, basically,
as they inevitably do.
As they inevitably do. Yes.
Just harking back to something that Rina brought up earlier on about sometimes maybe players will spend a very long time, and you were saying yourself, Lydia, examining a small piece of evidence and maybe analyzing it in a great degree of depth. How would you deal with that in terms of running a game? What sort of techniques would you use to keep the tension high if they are going stalling a little bit, maybe like that, or maybe they're not quite sure what to do or what to say, or if they go off script and start examining something that isn't actually relevant to the plot, but they've maybe fixed on. Just if I'll open that out for anyone if anyone wants to.
One of my favorite things to do in Call of Cthulhu specifically, but just I'll also do an adapted version of this for Cthulhu Dark, is I bring in power rolls and spooky things that are going to get them moving where I might not have had them before. So they're examining the paper and they're sniffing the ink, trying to find out where the ink came from. Make a power roll. And they're going to either have something horrible happen or they're going to learn something horrible or beyond the pale, so to speak, that's going to push them in another direction or push them to get moving or make them want to drop the paper and not look at it anymore because something just happened to them. So I'm thinking about all the different things that are happening in the scenario, the clues they're going to need, or the horrors that they're going to be facing, and I'm going to find a way to bring it in to that specific moment where they're stalling or they're spending too much time on one particular thing. So it ties back into the plot, and it also messes with them a little bit. But it's a way to keep the tension up, keep that things are happening. You need to be looking into things. You need to be investigating things, and also something terrible is happening to your mind right now. You have a vision, or you smell something really horrible that reminds you of like dead fish or whatever, and it takes you back to this moment. And so I will usually lean into the horror aspect of things. With an insight roll for Cthulhu Dark or a power roll for Call of Cthulhu. And I find that really has a way of getting them off the, okay, we're focusing on just this one clue and back into the narrative and the horror of the story. And it keeps the tension high, at least in my experience.
Great. And what about yourself, Kat? Are those the sort of techniques that you would use, or do you have any other advice for the viewers and listeners?
I think they're really good techniques. I think what I like about Rina's techniques, about how they use them, is that it's very much that you're doing it narratively, and I think that's important because sometimes it's quite tempting when you're a keeper to be very frustrated if you do have a group that seems to go around the houses a little bit, to be like, there's nothing here, just move on. The desire to say that is there, but actually that's not very immersive. It's not very helpful. And actually, there's something a little bit more interesting about saying, okay, well, you're looking at the files and you really don't think that there's much else here. You can't really see anything, but you do notice out of the corner of your eye something you didn't spot before. You do notice that there do seem to be some flecks of blood just near where the sort of the line of the door is that's leading out, and you didn't notice those before, but now that you've been really staring at these files, you just catch that, and it's almost saying like, there is nothing here, but there is something over there. But you're doing it in a way that keeps somebody still in the room, and I think that's important. Is keep your player in the room, keep them immersed in that fantasy, but don't be afraid to say, "There's nothing here. There's something over there." And then that might be calling for a spot hidden roll, or it might be, in the case of Cthulhu Dark, investigators tend to just get stuff because it's more about the narrative and moving people on. Something I have noticed about when players get stuck, or perhaps if they're really focusing on something, it might also be that it's been 6 weeks since the last game and they can't remember what they've got in their bag. And something that my husband does a lot for his games is he won't say, you've got this option. He's like, have a little bit of a think about who you've spoken to. Have a little bit of a think about some of the rooms that you've been in. Have a little bit of a think about maybe what you've picked up. and just leaves it at that. And then usually someone will go, what have I got in my bag? Oh yeah. And it's that getting people to kind of go back a little bit, because sometimes, especially with the campaigns, the pacing can be interrupted by player memory, and it's nothing wrong with the players. It's purely scheduling people is like herding a bunch of cats, and it might be 2 months, 3 months since your last game, and one person's written it in their notes, but the other 3 haven't. So that can sometimes be quite helpful.
And the person who's written it has possibly lost the notes.
Yes, yeah. Sometimes I will sit there and I'll go, who's that NPC you're talking about that maybe came up once 3 months ago? I don't remember, but roll with it.
What about yourself, Lydia? How do you? What techniques would you use if, for instance, your players have kind of run out of ideas and they're kind of struggling to know what direction to go in next?
Well, I think it's important to remember that you can never predict what a player is going to do, and that just sort of goes with the territory of being in a game or running a game or anything. It's just a natural thing, and so it's not unexpected. Don't be too freaked out when it happens, because players are going to do what players are going to do. For longer campaigns, I tend to sort of roll with what they want to do, even if they're sort of chasing a slightly bit of a dead end, for a little while anyway. Because if it's just going to be one scene in weeks and weeks and weeks of play, then that's sort of okay, so long as they don't go too far off piste when they might need to be gently shepherded back. But for one shots, that is a bit different, because you do want to sort of keep to time and not go too far into the weeds. I think when there's a problem, a big problem that I think a lot of keepers face, particularly newer keepers, is when the players dread a bad thing is going to happen, so they try and stop it. But that needs to happen for the plot to progress. And I really like what Kat said about sometimes you need to say, hey guys, the plot is over here, come back over here. But I think that's something I'm still developing myself, about how best to do that, because you're absolutely right, Kat. It is disruptive to say, look, this is nothing going on here. You actually need to go to XYZ or to leave. But it is disruptive and it is not immersive at all. So I really like what you said about the techniques that you use. And I think that's something that I would certainly like to take away from this panel and use that as I continue as a keeper. Something I have done in the past is to have an official sounding NPC intervene. Maybe it's a police officer or a traffic warden. Maybe it's just the butler who says, the party is over, monsieur. May I help you to a taxi? You know, it's just somebody who it's got nothing to do with the plot. So it subconsciously kind of suggests to the players that this is not part of the story. This is just somebody who's shepherding you in the right direction. And then, of course, the nuclear option, I think, is just to fall back on an int roll. But again, it is quite disruptive and it's a bit metagamey and a bit railroady. And you don't want to be railroady even when you're on the Orient Express. So, you know.
Absolutely not. Just picking up on what you were saying there about gently guiding the players in a direction. How important a part do you feel allowing your players their agency, their full agency, relies on or connects to the pacing of a game? Do you feel that managing player agency disrupts the pacing, or how do you find it shapes it?
I often keep a lot of my clues and interactions and things fluid when it comes to scenarios. I have very few things that are, you must do this in this exact order and you must find this at this place, because it doesn't allow for a lot of player agency necessarily. Like there's some things that are very tightly contained Necropolis style, where you are going to find things in a certain place and then you are going to be moving around in specific locations because you're in a confined space. Like Saturday the 14th does that. But most of
Why,
my
that's today,
scenarios,
isn't it?
I know. But in general, I try to keep things movable. So if they're very set on going off in this different direction, which I might have to improv part of because it wasn't in my original scenario, and they're not going in the direction where I would think they would logically go based on how things are set up, I've got the clues from the place that they should be going over to this NPC now. This NPC can give that information, or can direct them to someone who can give them the information. I've got this one random handout that is the only handout in the entire game, that can be found here instead of over there in that dusty old tome at the basement of the library where they decided not to go. So I try to keep things fluid so that when the players decide they want to talk to someone else or they want to go to a different place, or they antagonize somebody so badly that that person's not going to reasonably give them the information that they were going to get from them, I can run with it. So it gives them the ability to make their own decisions, to do what their characters want to do without me having to force them into, but you need this clue, or but wouldn't you rather go here? Or creating a Deus Ex Machina to literally force them into a space I need them to go. So I try to have multiple routes for getting to things. Most of my scenarios have multiple routes for getting to the end game, even based on here's things that might happen. Um, and I think that's a very helpful strategy, or it has been for me, when making sure that players are having a good time and doing their things versus I am the GM and I know how this is supposed to go and I want you to do things in a very specific way, because that's not fun for anybody.
Sure, sure. And what about if you have players at the table that may have different levels of engagement, how do you utilize techniques and experience to manage the pacing in that sort of game? Uh, Anybody like to pick up that, Cat?
This is actually an area that I still struggle with sometimes, depending on the people in the group. I think it is, again, it's trying to do it as narratively as possible, trying to move things on. So if you've got kind of a lot of people who are really, really joking and really having a good time, but may also be maybe starting to talk about things that aren't actually relevant to the game because something in the game has led to perhaps talking about something else that has led to a discussion about pizza, and actually you want to come back. Sometimes you do have to step out of the game and go, hey guys, let's just come back, and that's okay. Because sometimes if you're with a group of friends, you might start talking about something that you did on Saturday because an NPC in the game discussed a barbecue, and it's okay to go, but back to the game. You're all standing around and you're all having this discussion. Are you talking about, and sometimes it's, are you talking about barbecues in character or are you not? And just reminding people kind of, are they having an in-character conversation, out of character conversation? And then saying, and kind of almost bringing that in. I think it's okay to do that. You're running a game. You can't do everything narratively all the time. You'll go nuts. There will be times where it's okay to sort of draw people back in and just remind everybody that you're playing. And that's just doing that gently, or sort of just saying, okay, so and guys, okay, so you're here and you're talking about this. You talked about barbecue. So what are you going to do? And almost throw it back to the players a little bit, like, what are you going to do now? What is the next step? Okay, guys, what's going to happen? What are you going to do now? And I think there's techniques for that. I think if you've got a group of people who are really, really engaged and then one person who really isn't, sometimes it's perhaps trying to get an understanding of why that is that person new to the group and actually they're kind of terrified of everybody and they don't know how to interact with all these people who have all been playing together for 3 months. So is it actually you need to spend a little bit more time with them, with their character, and getting their character interacting with other people's characters to build that relationship, so maybe they do get a bit more invested? Is it because actually this isn't really their jam? Maybe they were at a convention and someone's brought their friend and their friend really doesn't like horror. So I would try and engage that person with that. What do you like? What are you interested in? Trying to kind of bring some of their interests in, perhaps their character stuff, if they're not really used to it, not really used to horror, kind of trying to almost ask questions, I think, really engage with that person. And then if someone's really, really not engaged, it might be then stepping outside, if you're in a campaign and someone's been quite disruptive for a couple of sessions or a session, and people have sort of said that's when you step outside of the game space and you have a chat, because sometimes you do need to do that, and it's not comfortable, but actually ultimately, is it going to make the game better in the long run? Because it might be that there's something going on there, and it might be that actually that person didn't even know that they weren't contributing, or maybe they didn't really understand what was going on. Maybe they do feel a bit uncomfortable. So have a chat, I think, in that instance. But there's narrative things you can do. But when narrative stuff isn't working, you're playing a game, you're having fun, you can step outside and say, hey guys, back to the game.
Sure. Rina, Lydia, you have any response to that? Any other techniques that you use to keep the pacing moving if you've got different levels of engagement?
Yes, I think that there are techniques that you can use as a performer as well. And yes, I'm speaking as a podcaster, but these are techniques that are definitely relevant for home games as well, for getting people's concentration and for creating a mood. Because when people are invested emotionally in the mood and the atmosphere that you're creating, they're going to be a lot less likely to play about on their phone or start thinking about pizza, as Kat says. And I think one of the techniques that I personally like to use to try and control the mood is to think about your own vocal register and think about how you talk and your own patterns of speech, and to consciously change that when you want to really get people's focus in. And the temptation, I think, can sometimes be to talk very brightly and to talk very loudly and bring the energy up. But sometimes that doesn't have the right effect, because it just everybody else starts talking loudly as well. So something I like to do is drop the vocal register a bit, take it down, talk a bit more slowly in a quieter register, put a bit more breath behind what you're saying. Because when you pause, you can really focus people's attention. And sometimes the quieter you talk, the more people want to listen as well. So that's a performance technique that I use personally.
And absolutely, and we are playing horror games, and I think that use of the voice, and use of the volume of the voice and pacing of your own voice can certainly bring people in closer, and elevate the tension, and elevate the attention
Yes,
of the players as well.
Whether or not you got a microphone in front of you, it's still a performance, and that's part of it, I think, being a keeper.
Yeah, sure. Just picking up on that again, with the different kinds of games that you might be playing within the horror genre. Obviously, we've all played lots of different games with different groups of people, and there's been different moods within the games. Some of them a lot more serious and kind of emotionally intensive, but maybe some that have kind of leaned more to the more sort of light-hearted. How would you adjust your pacing based on that, based on their reactions to each other and to the game itself, especially if the group is more light-hearted, or alternatively more easily terrified than you might have expected? Rina, would you have any thoughts on that?
So I try to gauge what the tone of the group is before we play, like what at the start. And obviously, this is easier if you know all the people you're playing with. Anytime I go into an Ain't Slayed Nobody game, for example, I know exactly the kind of nonsense I'm getting. Wonderful, wonderful nonsense. But when it comes to a con game, or a game like you're running at your library for people who are just learning to play RPGs or whatever, I try to gauge what they're going to be like. Like, I observe the interactions around the table before we start. But I also have something I do where I ask character questions at the start of a scenario. This might be a question about your character specifically. It might be about a question about how your character relates to another character in the group, if you're a group that's been together for a while in the terms of the scenario. And how people respond to that, one, builds the group dynamic, For example, you might have a question like, what's a hobby that you share with character X? Or character Y saved your life in the war. How did they do that? And how do you feel about them now? And how they respond to things gives me an idea of how seriously are they taking this? Or are they going to lean more into the humorous aspect of things, which then lets me change my approach a bit more to I'm going to make this a bit more of a lighter humor, or I'm going to make this more serious. I'm going to draw out that tension. I'm going to slowly build it versus okay, you want horrible hijinks, you're getting horrible hijinks, and so that setting up that expectation for yourself at the beginning of the scenario, I find can be extremely helpful because then you're not getting into this really atmospheric description building up to something horrible coming into the room and your players are cracking jokes. Right. So getting that idea of what kind of group you're playing with first and then adjusting your expectation based on that. I do find that sometimes, especially in con games, the listing of what a scenario is will help you do that as well, because um, based on how it's worded, people are going to go into certain games expecting something super heavy, like Friends of Dorothy deals with queer phobia, for example. People do not come into that game, so far in my experience, expecting to make a lot of dick jokes or laugh at things or whatever. Like, there's going to be humor in it, but they're looking for something a little bit more serious because that's what the description says. And so when I'm approaching that game, I'm definitely going for the more reflective, introspective kind of game. Whereas Saturday the 14th, it's a slasher. You're probably going to get a lot of hijinks. So just these tools that I give myself as the GM, even before I start the game, really help me manage that expectation of where are we going humor-wise, where are we going horror-wise, and how am I going to adjust my play style for this group.
Kat, Lydia, if you are perhaps intending to run a very suspenseful, very psychologically maybe disturbing even game, and you encounter the players that are at your table, and just you discover fairly early on that maybe they are, or some of them are becoming scared, becoming more terrified of the things that are happening in the game than you had anticipated. What would be the sort of techniques that you would use in order to make sure that they have an enjoyable time, but in terms of the pacing, particularly, I'm thinking, but also to try not to torture the actual players rather than the characters.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Rina on the setting up beforehand, kind of. So I think with games, I would always have something like an X card or something on the table where if this is people are getting more easily scared, it's never really an issue because again, you can kind of you can change the temperature of what you're delivering, and if you're noticing that people are getting more scared or they're getting kind of, I like the term squicked out, or like kind of a bit like at stuff that you perhaps as somebody who has a different tolerance level wouldn't find necessarily perhaps because you've been desensitized by playing horror games for too long. I find that you can change that. You just perhaps you lighten up on the description. Perhaps you sort of just change a little bit of maybe what you're bringing in. Perhaps there's some scenes in there that are going to be a bit heavier that you just go, do you know what? Actually, I can still throw that in, but I'm just going to omit some stuff. But I'd always have something like almost kind of something where the players can go, do you know what? Actually, I really am becoming uncomfortable with this. Can we pause and actually can we check in? And it might be that it's not like an X card entirely of I've hit X and therefore we're not going to talk about this and that's never ever going to come in again. It's let's slow down, let's pause, let's have a chat. What is it about this is actually causing that? How are you feeling right now? Do you need to take a break? Do you need a glass of water? How is everybody feeling around the table? What is it about this? You don't need to go into details. And it might be that is removed, or perhaps it's just it can still come in, but it just needs to maybe omit some of the seriously described gory detail, and you can take that out and it's not going to diminish your game if you pivot a little bit. And it's all about that improvisation, so definitely having some kind of safety net in there, but also like Rina said, setting up at the beginning. When I play Ravenous, it's a bit more silly because you're getting eaten by things that are, it's you're a rave group who've basically stumbled onto a ship, and it's not going to be too serious. What the trees remember goes into themes of self-harm and suicide, and that's a lot of more heavy a topic. So when we first start, it's this is what it's going to contain. This can get quite intense. This is where you can go for support. Are you still happy to continue and play? And if we need to pivot, we need to pivot, and that's fine. But I'd definitely say having some kind of safety plan in there, just in case somebody does, because you don't know what people's triggers are, and you don't know what people's trauma are, and they might think that they're okay, and you might think you're okay, and then you start running something and suddenly it hits you like a ton of bricks. And it's okay to be human and go, fuck, I need to breathe a second, can we stop? And that's okay. That's perfectly fine. It's a game.
So that's a very good point indeed, because I think sometimes one can go into a game not expecting to be affected by it, but then something comes up, excuse me, something comes up out of the blue, as you said, which suddenly has a much deeper, more profound effect on you than you expected it to. Lydia, what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I would completely agree. I think in an ideal world, having a session 0 where you know in advance what are the areas which are a completely no-go and this is off the table, what are the areas that it's, yes, we can bring it into the story, but let's not get too detailed. But that's not always possible when you're doing a pickup game on a Discord server or at a con. So yes, as you said, I think it's important to be able to just dial it back a little bit if people are getting genuinely upset out of character. And I think an analogy you can use is to think about films and film editing. It's like if something is a 12 certificate, you'll still see the punching, but you just might not see the punch actually connect with the person's face, and you might not see their nose break, but it's happened. There's no need to actually go into the gory detail because it's just part of the story. So just to think about how to continue on, but without getting into that gruesome detail and just dialing it back just a little bit. And to go back to the idea of laughter and if people are going to be joking around, I think there's a fine line, isn't there, between shock and horror and amusement. Rina looking amazing in their blood-spattered outfit today. The first thing I did when I saw Rina come onto camera was I laughed, because I think it's a very natural thing. And so I think it's important also to not be too upset immediately if the first response of something dramatic and awful happening is laughter in game. Disruptive laughter and disruptive joking around is totally different. As long as people are acting in good faith and they have a moment of hysterical laughter, that's okay. And as long as you can bring it back, and if everybody's on the same page, I think it's, as both Rena and Kat have said, to sort of know what game that you're playing. And I really liked the question idea that Rena said about how to sort of gauge how people are going to respond to the theme and the topics that you want to bring up. I don't know if you use it, but Heinrich's Guide to Character Creation is a really good one for that, which sort of helps to bring relationships together, character relationships beforehand. So it's like, you owe a favor to X character. What is it? How do you feel about that? You feel resentment or something. So that's a really good way of building those character relationships and those kind of the vibe before you even open the scenario book.
What about situations where, for instance, there has been a particularly heavy or traumatic scene, and one or more of your players has maybe kind of backed away from that, or had a reaction to that, and you have had to take a moment just to kind of breathe and relax and make sure everybody's okay. How would you then pick up and start rebuilding the tension? What sort of pacing techniques would you use in order to be able to get the scenario back to a kind of state where you are moving towards the kind of moving the scenes towards the climax, if it were, or or just rebuilding that tension organically?
I think when you've had to take that pause and when somebody's been upset is to dial it up slowly and not go too strong right out of the gate again, so that you have a better idea of where is the point, where is the cutoff point that you need to stop. And now you know that something is an issue, you can stop before it becomes an issue again. So just responding to what's already just happened, I think, is an important thing for everybody's enjoyment.
And I think something that Jason has brought up on the stream there as well is that many groups there will be elements of humor that come out of desperate situations. This kind of gallows humor where people are a very, I think, very human reaction towards something horrible is to invoke a kind of almost a knee-jerk laugh reflex or a joke reflex from it. Certainly, when I think of something that's a very dark and horrific story which has a distinct element of humor in it, is I think of the play Macbeth, which has got that scene in it with the porter, which is absolutely
Yes.
ludicrous.
Yeah.
And it's right in the middle of buckets of blood and horrible things being done in this kind of
Yeah.
lust for power. So the idea of humor in horror is not by any stretch of the imagination a new one. Just something that I wanted to move on to in terms of the actual methodology of bringing horror into a game, bringing ramping up the tension and making building the horror to to boiling point, but maybe not beyond. Specific mechanics is what I'm thinking of, like countdown clocks, sanity trackers, that sort of thing. Are there any mechanics that you might find built into systems, or perhaps ones that you yourself use to maintain the pace and build the tension? Kat, what are your thoughts on that?
I think mechanics always I struggle with, because I usually play rules light games. So Cthulhu Dark, I'll usually run those, because I sometimes find, for me, as a keeper and as a storyteller, I find mechanics can get in the way sometimes. But that's not to say that they cannot be used in a really clever way. So whilst I sometimes sort of err away from mechanics because it's not my cup of tea, some people I know have used mechanics in incredibly good ways. The sanity loss system for Call of Cthulhu, whenever I've played with Scott, it's never been, you've gone insane, I'm going to read off a checklist. And we talked a little bit about this in the panel yesterday. It's, you've gone insane. How? What are you doing? And there was a scene in Black Shade where the way that I went insane was I had to find out where this noise was coming from. So it led to me picking up a phrenology head and braining someone with it because they were in the way of the door where the noise was, and that created a real sense of pace, because suddenly the doctor's dead, there's this thing happening, and it sped it up, and it was part of the mechanics of that sanity loss. So rather than the sanity loss hindering me, because if it had rolled on the table, there's one which is like you faint and you fall over and you kind of don't get up for 6 hours. Well, that's going to kill your pacing, massively kill your pacing. If you've got a character that's incapacitated for 6 hours, that's actually quite boring for the player. But for me, being able to go, okay, I'm insane, and how do I want to lean into this? And I do that with the sanity dice or the insight dice in Cthulhu Dark, is if someone hits 6 early. So if you hit 6 in the insight dice, you go insane in Cthulhu Dark. Now you could hit 6 really quick. You could hit 6 about half an hour into a 3-hour game. And if that character is then indefinitely insane, but your character is quite integral to the plot line, actually that could be quite disruptive to the pacing and actually quite boring for the player. So it's, you're insane, but how? what secret do they get? What are they now suddenly on the side of the villains or the eldritch horror? How does that work? So you might take them out of the room and have a conversation with them, which is, you've gone off the deep end and you're here, and how would you like to play that? And suddenly there's subterfuge, and you can get creative with stuff like that. I'd say if something in the game mechanics is going to hinder the pacing of your game, tweak it slightly, because you can do that. I think that can really be used in a creative way.
So I think, Kat, you were talking quite a lot there about a very rules-light system like Cthulhu Dark, and how it has very, very simple mechanics, but you can use that to employ those to give players a lot of freedom themselves. What about maybe systems that have more mechanics, that are more kind of more I'm not going to say clunky. That's not the right word. Systems that have a lot more tweaks and parts of them that mechanically ramp up this kind of tension. Lydia, do you have any insights on that?
Yeah, I mean, rather than a system, what comes to mind for me is a specific scenario. And that is the necropolis. And I think it does that extremely well in terms of specific mechanics in it. And I'll try and be as spoiler light as I possibly can. But basically, along with all the normal Call of Cthulhu mechanics, you have two other things to keep an eye on to use for your players. And one of them is that you're in a very dark place, a completely dark place with no natural light, but one of the investigators has 4 candles in their bag. And each one of these candles burns for 1 hour. So there's this horror as the game continues, and you could, if you wanted to, I think, probably have a stopwatch on the table and to actually say, right, you've now burned down 1 candle. You only have 3 left. If you wish to, I think you could do that. Even though the game is designed to be played in a lot less than 4 hours, I think if you wanted to, expand it a bit, you could do that. But having the candles and the darkness is, I think it's about the narrative as well as the mood, because you've got this horror of being trapped in a completely dark place, but it also forces the investigators to move on and not to hang around for too long. And the second mechanic that you can use is the very fact that you're in a very fragile building. And if they don't move on, if they spend too much time in the first room, then it's suggested in the text to say some debris falls from the ceiling. If they start to try and do too much to the walls, again, debris from the ceiling. And it forces the plot on, as well as the actual mood that you're creating of this tension, of this place, that you can't disrupt the place you're in too much because the ceiling will fall in. But you also can't waste time thinking, because you only have 4 hours of light left, or you're going to spend the rest of your very short and miserable life trapped in a very dark place, quite literally.
You have no idea how strong the impulse was to shout out
So-
handles for forks.
Forks.
How much I had to hold myself
you.
back.
I'm so with you. Yeah. Every single time I run it, every time somebody does that.
I think it's
you are
deliberately
in
written
good
for that.
company there, Spike.
So I think that's a very good point, Daniel. There can be parts of the scenario itself which lend themselves towards, provide tools for you to use for that sort of thing. But I wonder, Rina, are there any systems that you've used that have things like countdown clocks or anything that you've found that help? I know you're running Trail of Cthulhu at the minute, which has a different mechanic to it.
So with Trail of Cthulhu at the moment, the thing I'm enjoying is it's making me change up my pacing a bit when it comes to things like this, because there's no hiding clues behind rolls. So you get things. You have a skill and you're using your skill and you get the thing. I we're still at a point where I can't really say if we've done combat or anything yet, because those episodes haven't come out. But I will say that like the pacing of things like that is very different, and it's made me like change how I approach that. But the games I tend to run tend to be Call of Cthulhu and Cthulhu Dark and things of that nature. So I don't tend to run very crunchy games, or is it Blades in the Dark, which has countdown clocks, things like that. Um, I haven't really run or played in things like that. So uh, mechanically built into the game itself, like the system itself, I don't have a whole lot of experience with that. I tend to build my own things into the scenarios when I run them to try and keep the pacing going.
Right. So I think we've spoken quite a lot about the scenarios, and maybe they've got specific uh, sections of them, or there are tools within the scenario itself that help you with the pacing, that help move things along, speed up, slow down. Maybe there are moments in the game where you really want to have a sense of atmosphere and suspense, where you maybe kind of bring the speed of action right down, and then perhaps other moments where you're building up to a climax, building up to an event of some kind, where you want to maybe increase the pace a little bit. Um, how would you say you recognize, well, in your experience, how would you recognize when it is time to release that tension, to, if you've been building up the tension gradually just to a point where it's almost becoming unbearable. How would you recognize what the moment is, just to release it with maybe some piece of humor, or an event that just kind of breaks that tension, rather than let it simmer and build. Who would like to jump in with thoughts on that?
I
Let's.
think
Oh, yes, go for it, Lydia.
Okay. I think if you're playing with a group that you know well and you know each other's emotional responses to things and the sort of plot that they enjoy, it becomes instinctive after a while. And so you get to know the way that they're going to react. And if you know that you've got somebody who's maybe a bit trigger happy, then you know that you need to release that tension before they decide to throw a Molotov cocktail or something. So
Which
with
can be a
that,
tension release in
it
itself.
can indeed. It can indeed. But I think if you don't know the people that you're playing with, it's not always possible to know that, is it? So I think sometimes you also have to remember that you're there to have fun too, and you're running the game. So if you're not quite sure if it's the right moment, if you want it to be the right moment, then it is the right moment. Don't second guess yourself too much. If you think it's going to make a good time for everybody and it's what you would enjoy at this moment, you think it's the right time that you're going to enjoy exploding things, then do that. I think, and if it turns out you could have pushed it a little bit further, then you'll know that for next time. Keeping and the skills of keeping is always a work in progress, no matter how short or long a time you've been doing it. So I'd say don't second guess yourselves too much. Sometimes just do it.
I'd 100% agree with it. I think anyone who says that they have nothing left to learn is someone who doesn't know what they need to learn, maybe. Um,
I go
in
off
you,
gut instinct quite a bit to follow up with what Lydia was saying. Like gut instinct is the major thing, and I much prefer playing with cameras on when I'm in an online game for that reason, because body language tells me a lot. The way people's faces are reacting to things, how their bodies are shifting. Like, are they leaning in? I've had games where I've had all my players doing this at the same time, and that tells me, all right, we're coming up on the most tense climactic point here, and now it's time to ease off a bit because I don't want them to explode from tension right now. Or people are too relaxed when I'm doing something. Okay, time to amp it up. And so I go off of, and this comes from running a lot of games. I run games so much that I think I've got more of an instinctive feeling from it because I've spent so much time with it, especially if it's something I've run before. Um, that it's a little hard to put into words like here are the things exactly that I do to manage that tension or to know when to release because I've learned from people's body language and how people react to things. And it's going to be different for different groups, like Lydia was saying. You know the group you've been playing with for a long time and you know what their cues are, but you get a different group at a convention. And like I'm running Saturday the 14th in a couple hours for a group at this convention. And I don't know how they're going to respond to certain things in that scenario. But I've read enough people's body language that I will be able to some extent at least, read how they're reacting to things and go off my gut feeling of, all right, now I'm going to do this, or I'm going to hold that off for a little bit. But it comes with experience and intentionally reading people, like not just I picked it up as I went. I have intentionally spent time reading the people that I play with in all my different groups, conventions, whatever, so that I can create this sort of image library in my brain to train myself to know when to react to things.
Great. Yeah. What about new keepers, though? Kat, do you have any advice you could maybe give to a new keeper who doesn't have that experience and doesn't necessarily feel they have that gut instinct?
I'd say be kind to yourself. The first few times I ran a game, like I felt so out of my depth. I was shitting myself, to be quite honest. The adrenaline rush that you get from running a game, I still get that now. I still get some of those doubts. I still have those feelings where I'm like, oh my god, did people actually enjoy that? Your players will show you if your players are engaged and having fun. They'll show you that they're enjoying it. And to be honest, I think it is a case of just have a go with it. And if you're enjoying yourself, most of the time everybody else is enjoying themselves too. But definitely be kind to yourself. Don't beat yourselves up too much for you're doing a really good service being a keeper. So many people don't want to do that. So many people would just rather play the fact that you are being a keeper and you get to be in that role and you get to be God, and you get to control the events and you get to do that. That's a really fun thing to do, but it's also a lovely thing to do for a group of friends or a group of people who really want to play. They're there to play, they're there to have fun, and they want you to succeed. Most people at the game table want you to succeed. So I'd say be kind to yourself, give yourself some time. Don't worry too much if you can't hold it all in your head. One of the things I used to do was I used to think if I'm running a written scenario and I haven't covered everything in the scenario, or they've missed a room, or I've missed a piece of information, I've done a bad job. But like Rina said earlier, it's so much easier if you know your beginning and you know your end, and everything in the middle can move around. So just know roughly where you want them to go and how you want them to get there, and just let the players, and they'll do a lot of the work for you, to be quite frank. And anything you prep, they will likely destroy anyway. So if you're doing 5 hours of prep, just know that you probably won't cover even probably 2/3 of that. So be gentle with yourself and have fun with it. Just play around.
I think that's great advice. Yeah, be kind to yourself. I think it's very important lesson. So we've spoken a little bit about how you manage the pace and the tension with different players, with building and releasing tension. How would you use the actual structure of a scenario, or maybe you wouldn't? Maybe you would just tear the structure up and use an organic structure or a structure of your own. So say we've got different acts in a scenario or different scenes in a scenario or beats. How would you use that to manage that pacing and the climactic moment or moments that you might have in a scenario? Anyone have thoughts on that?
I tend to have some very specific moments, like even when I'm playtesting, when I've only got 3 bullet points on a napkin kind of thing. I have an idea of I know where I want to take the midpoint break. This is a climactic moment or an important moment or an exciting moment that I want to end on for the first half or whatever. If we're taking 2 breaks, the first third, if we're splitting it up into 3 parts or whatever, and I have that moment in my head and then I write it into the scenario when I write it out. Or if it's just for a session of something else I'm running, here's where we want to get to before we take that break. And it tends to be something that's hard hitting, or that is a big moment of revelation, or the first moment of something truly awfully horrible happening, like finding a key NPC dead, or something that happens in Saturday the 14th is the characters live long enough to get to that point. Things like that, I have them in my mind so that when I'm keeping an eye on the clock and okay, we've got 20 minutes before we take our first take the first break, the comfort break, whatever. All right, so I'm going to start ramping things up to get to this point, or I'm going to start moving my pieces around to get to this point. And so I start there with the half point, and then when I go back into my acts, when I'm prepping or when I'm running the game itself, I have these little things of okay, this is a high beat. This is a moment we want to hit. All right, that's in this act, so we need to get to here. I don't time it out the way I do the midpoint because no plan survives contact with the players, as we've discussed. They're going to do other things, but especially with moments I can move, like finding the dead NPC somewhere else. I'm like, okay, so they're building up to this. All right, now I think I'm going to hit them with that so we can move on to the next bit. All right, they're getting hit with this moment. So I have those key moments for the scenario in my head, and I space them out to keep that tension, keep that pace going. And I'll even have some moments for some scenarios that are more investigative versus flat out madness, where it's like if things are getting too slow, they're slowing down or they're getting stuck on something, we're going to throw in something hard hitting, something high octane right here. So I can pull them out of my bank, so to speak. So having those beats that I can hit, whether they're fluid or whether they're fixed, like a midpoint break, that's been the most helpful thing for me.
Absolutely agree. And anybody else have any further thoughts on that?
I would agree with Rena. I think it's all about finding the beats of the story. For me, I like to, if it's a one shot, I like to try and pick out 3 key moments in the story. One in the hook, one around about the turning point of the big clue when the investigators start realizing what it is that's going on, and that sort of moment where you reach the top of the mountain, and then from there on, it's a journey towards endgame. And then something within the climax, which doesn't necessarily have to be the actual climax itself, because I think sometimes the aftershocks of what happened at the end of the story can be their own horror as well. And the consequences of what the investigators have done and what does this now mean for the rest of their lives, that can sometimes carry a sequel hook, or it can just carry something which stays with the player group afterwards. So just trying to find those 3 moments in a story, I think, is where I like to start crafting the peaks and troughs of the horror. The very first scenario I ever ran was Mask of Desire from the Does Love Forgive collection. And with that one, it was a good 30 minutes of play before we actually reached the big starting hook of the story, before the thing which happens, which really begins the horror. So I really took some care with that one to try and craft a bit of weirdness before that moment happens. A small mystery, just a little bit of a signpost to say that all is not well at this place you're in, and there is something a little bit odd about the hostess of the party that you're at. I think you can find something in the setup of any scenario to do that. Maybe it's an NPC who's a bit hostile for no reason. Maybe it's a very odd and unnatural weather pattern or something in the natural landscape. Just something to sort of set up a bit of foreboding if you know that the way that the story's written, the plot isn't going to arrive promptly. I think that's particularly useful when the first scene of your scenario is the classic Call of Cthulhu conventional event. You've all been sent to a lecture or a party, or you've gone to see an old friend who you haven't seen since your school days because they've sent you a letter to say, please come and visit and help me do XYZ. Finding a bit of horror before the horror starts, just that foreboding, and craft the atmosphere before everything turns to horror, basically.
I'm not going to say before everything turns to shit.
Well, that's it. But this is a very family-friendly con, so
is it? Oh, dear.
language.
No. Who invited
No,
me
it's
then?
not really. It's not really.
Oh shit.
Yes, everything turns to unpleasantness and shenanigans.
That's actually a very good point. I don't know if there was anything that you wanted to pick up on from what Lydia was saying there, Kat. But I was. Oh, sorry. Go on. Yep.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say. I think the breaking it into three is quite a good one. So when I write a scenario, I have the beginning and the end, and then usually what I have in between is NPCs and interesting locations, and maybe one or two or three things that I kind of feel like are important to the story. And sometimes I don't really know what they are. They're just ideas. So when I wrote Ravenous, I wanted there to be the classic, you fill up at a petrol station or you go into a creepy shop, and it's like, this town's creepy, everything's creepy, kind of, that atmosphere setting. Then I wanted it to be you explore the cruise ship, and then I wanted it to be you escape. And it was those three beats: creepy gas station, get to the cruise ship and onto the cruise ship, escape. And that was it. And then it was the players that kind of led all the way through. And although I knew kind of, bits of details, I knew what the monsters were, I knew kind of some information they could find, I didn't fret too much about all of the little details. And I think sometimes the details can stop you from pacing your game because you get too wrapped up in where you're going to put them. So definitely break it down into your beginning, your middle, and your end. And when it comes to the middle, don't try and plan that out too much, because that can sometimes get you you can get stuck in the middle.
I think the thing that I was wanted to pick up on from what Lydia was saying, you mentioned one of the scenarios in Does Love Forgive, which I believe is a one keeper, one player scenario collection.
Yeah.
Do you feel that there is a different kind of a pacing required for a single player and keeper game? I'm talking specifically about Call of Cthulhu, but this could be any horror role-playing game, than there is from, say, a group of 4 or maybe 5 players?
Oh, very much so. Very much so. Lynn Hardy once said to me that there's nowhere to hide in a one-to-one scenario for either the player or the keeper. And I think that really rings true for me. And also, because when you've only got one player and one keeper, it's far harder to put heads together because there's nobody for the player to talk to. So they've only got their own ideas, and there's no way to discuss an idea or to test a theory. So what we were saying earlier about the difficulties of keeping them on the storyline and not going off on a tangent or not going too far down a rabbit hole that doesn't have anything at the bottom of the hole because, the story is actually in the other room. It's a lot more difficult, I found, to signpost the player back to where they ought to be when there's only one of them. But I think that really works with cosmic horror because it's all about isolation, and it's all about not knowing whether what you're seeing is real and not being able to trust your own mind, particularly with Call of Cthulhu with its insanity mechanics. So I think it really works with Call of Cthulhu in particular, but it is a whole different kind of challenge, I think. I love it, but it is a different kind of challenge.
Rina, I know that you've certainly played at least one of the scenarios from that collection. What thoughts do you have on the difference in pacing between a solo player game and a multiplayer game?
Well, from the player perspective, because I've played both the scenarios in there. Can't remember the names at the moment. Does Love Forgive and Mask of Desire? That's what it was. I've played both of them, but we played one of them as a solo scenario, and then the other one we had a second character come in. And the play was definitely different because I was playing a detective in the first one, Does Love Forgive? And so I was having to put together all the clues and everything in my head. And I didn't have as many NPCs to talk things out with. Like sometimes you can sit down with a friendly NPC and talk things out between you and the GM playing the NPC.
At
But
length,
it
if
was
necessary.
at length, yes. um, but in the second one, in Mask of Desire, I had my secretary character being played by Cup, who I could at least talk at. Um, so have a sounding board kind of thing. But it also felt it the first one felt more reflective because I was thinking things through on my own and I was processing things um, to myself. And it definitely felt like a more reflective, more isolating, not in a bad way, not isolating in a bad way, but like your sole investigator moving through the story, which happens a lot in stories of the era, right? The horror stories of the era. You've got your sole protagonist, who's going through horrible things and learning things and having to research and deal with all of that. So it felt very interesting from that perspective, thinking of myself as that classic kind of Lovecraftian sort of investigator, versus going in a group and solving things. And I've also run Jolene as a solo game before. It's the only one of my scenarios I've ever run as a solo game. And Jolene is a story about love and loss and loneliness at its heart and addiction. And running it, since I've run it different ways, running it for the one person has been very different than running it for the group. Because you can really lean in more into that sense of isolation, really lean more into that sense of loss, and then you're not meeting up with a group of other people who give you a kind of community, even though you don't know them. You're meeting them. You've got a purpose to work together. You're feeling that I'm alone. I'm doing this because I feel like I need answers, but I'm in an unfamiliar place with unfamiliar people, and it makes me feel things more deeply. Like that's what the player told me, and that's how I had to run it for them, was building on that sense of isolation, that sense of loss, that sense of being an alien, so to speak, in this strange city, this strange situation that they're in. And I find it becomes a lot more emotional in a lot of ways when you're running for single player. And so you have to build out those moments so that you don't overwhelm the player with emotion, or horrible, 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 horrible. Because also you don't have anybody else to take the brunt of sand loss, or someone else to be focused on by the mobster or by the Shoggoth or whatever. It's all you, buddy. Or it's all your single player. And so you have to figure out, how do I time these encounters pacing wise so that I don't kill this character or drive them insane 30 minutes into the game. So you really have to change how you approach your beats emotionally, but also your beats when it comes to the story itself, when you're doing a solo player versus a multiplayer.
I absolutely agree. Yeah, I think that's a very good point that you raised about the fact that with a solo player, it is all you, buddy. Kat, have you
Yeah.
have you had that similar sort of experience with? I don't know if you've played much single player and keeper games, single player and GM games.
I've never actually played a single player GM game at all, but it's taken me to my counselling training, weirdly, because I think that it is incredibly intimate to be one-on-one with someone, and you have a lot of things going on neurologically in your brain. If you've got your defense mechanisms, your fight, your flight, you've also got friend, freeze, and flop. And friend is where you mimic somebody that you're with, and if you're alone with somebody and you're feeling unsettled and you're unsafe, you're going to do things like grin, or you're going to do things like laugh, because that's how we appease the other person in the room. That's when we feel threatened, we try to appease the threat, or we perhaps try to go towards the thing that actually is going to help us. So we go towards our caregiver, we go towards the person in the room who's our friend. So I can imagine that when you're having that one-on-one situation and you're doing it with horror, you're going to hit on some of that. that real friend trigger. And I think you're going to hit on your mirror neurons as well, where you're really able to pick up on that other person's emotions, and where your neurons basically you're going to be mimicking behavior. And I can imagine if you're getting up and they're getting up and you're getting up, the pacing is then affected by how quickly are you both ramping each other up as a GM and as a player. So I've never played one, but seeing it from that perspective, knowing a bit about the neurology, I can imagine that you could have some incredibly powerful one-on-one horror games if you sort of then manage them properly. So I really want to play one.
I'm sure that can be arranged.
That's a really good point about, the friendship and the and NPCs, to go back to what Rina was saying and how it's all you. In the first scenario in the Does Love Forgive collection, the main NPC is a dog. So it's like, how can you have a conversation? It's like, what's that boy? Nyla Thotep fell down the well. It's like, how's that going to work?
Brilliant.
But he is a very good boy. So that does give some comfort to the investigator, at least.
So we have three very experienced keepers, GMs, and players here on the panel. But as we all know, no one is infallible. So I'd just like to pose a question to you all. So what are some of the common pitfalls that GMs might fall into when running horror games, particularly, and what sort of techniques can be used to avoid them? How would you avoid falling into them? Let's start with Lydia.
I think how you avoid them, if you knew how to avoid them, you wouldn't fall down the hole in the first place. So
let's say recognizable ones, pitfalls that you've maybe experienced yourself in the past and you've learned from.
I think it can be quite easy and quite tempting as a keeper to spend it all at once and to go relentlessly hard without any variation in the type of tension that you're building, or also to string out the plot over too long a period and to almost be too concerned to pull the trigger at the moment it needs pulling. And I think that can lead to fatigue, both on the part of the players and the keeper. So, as we were talking about earlier, I think sometimes it comes with experience, knowing when to release the tension and knowing how fast to take your horror and how fast to start building it. But I think part of pacing is about speed up and slow down and speed up and slow down. But again, as Kat was saying, you just have to treat yourself gently. And maybe a session didn't go the way that you wanted it to go. Maybe you think afterwards, yeah, I could have handled that scene a bit better. But that's just part of developing, I think, and we never stop developing, either as keepers or players. So yeah, don't be too upset when you do fall down a hole, I would suggest.
Some things I've seen, and something that I have to be careful of in myself, is getting too in love with a set piece or with a particular character to the point where you don't know when to let them go. You get too caught up in describing this creepy thing or the atmosphere that you're in, or you're enjoying the conversation between the PC and this NPC that you love or that you're fascinated by so much that you just let it keep going past the point when the conversation needs to end, or when you need to trigger something happening so that the conversation ends, or when you need them to move past this room. And part of that, and I've seen this from writers in particular, is so much detail when it comes to the room or when it comes to what the NPC looks like, that your players get stuck on the details. So you're in a tavern or whatever, you're in a pub, and there's 3 doors, and you describe the doors, and the players are going to want to look through each and every door. You talk about the NPC and how they're dressed, and you go into so much detail about them, and then the PCs are going to start wondering, what does this mean? What is the importance of this? And you don't want to leave things blank. Obviously, you want to have this fleshed out kind of world that you're in, but you want to avoid overwhelming people with too much detail to the point where they can't see the forest for the trees. And that's something I see quite a bit, especially in newer writers, like writing their own scenarios, or people who are book authors coming into writing games. They want to put in all of these little details. And then gamers are going to go, oh, that must be important because they spent time on that. Like they spent more than a couple seconds describing this part of the room, or describing the speech pattern of this NPC or whatever. Like our brains pick up on those things as players, and we think, well, if you're spending that time on it, it must be important. And so that can really interrupt the pacing of your game. It can really interrupt the tension that you're building. And the best way I've found to deal with that, because I had this tendency, especially when I first started out, is give the details that are important, figure them out in your head, write them down on a sheet of paper if you need to. When it comes to a room or NPCs, think of 2 or 3 things that give it color, use those things, and then move on. Like the color of the room is green, or the color on the walls is sage, or whatever. Like the NPC likes to wear, you can tell she likes to wear jewelry that was probably passed on from her grandmother because it's bakelite, this big chunky jewelry. That's a detail that gives us character without the players going, she likes bakelite jewelry? What horrible eldritch entity must she serve, kind of thing. So these details, a couple of them, that gives us character, that gives us description, without bogging down your players in minutia. So that would be the biggest thing for me.
And I think that's possibly particularly true of investigative horror, because the players are investigators and they're constantly looking for clues. So, if the keeper is describing a scene in some detail, I think the investigative mind, the searching for clues mind, is going to say, well, this is the keeper giving us a clue here that something should be investigated more thoroughly and in greater detail. And Kat, do you have any thoughts on that? On possible pitfalls to try and avoid?
Yeah, I think when I was a younger keeper, I would get really upset with myself, and I would get really worried about players not figuring things out, and that's okay. Your players are not going to figure out every puzzle. They're not going to find every piece of information, and also it actually lends to the horror more if they don't understand some stuff that's going on, or they don't understand what the monster is, or they don't understand why somebody's doing something and what the motivation is. And I found myself very early on, when I first started throwing out, almost saying what the thing was. So instead of saying this is, building up a scene and kind of giving hints and stuff, I would almost be saying this is the thing, because I would be worried about them not getting it, and I would be worried that maybe because they don't understand what's going on, I've hidden the story from them and I've kept it secret, and that's not fair. And actually, that's a lot of pacing is down to releasing it slowly and actually them not figuring out. And player failure is a good thing. So if a player fails a role, or if a player does something that might be seen as maybe they've messed up, that's good. Build that into the narrative, build that into the story, create tense moments with that, play with it, have something fun happen. Because I think sometimes if someone's failed a role and it leads to nothing, and you have a lot of failed roles and you're not really doing anything with that, then that makes the players think that they've not won something by rolling badly. And actually rolling badly and failing roles creates a whole different narrative. So they're part of your pathway. So lean into that. Lean into the failed roles, lean into the low scores, and have fun with those. Because I think before I used to be like, oh, everybody's rolling really badly, they're not going to get the stuff. But actually rolling badly is the stuff. So it took me a long time to kind of learn that. And there's certainly some things I still do now that I'd like to definitely improve on. I still worry that people aren't finding stuff, and I still sometimes have a moment of here, have this. And actually they didn't need that. So yeah, there's lots to learn, and give yourself some time.
I think that's a great way of putting it. Rolling badly is the stuff. I think that's excellent. And we've talked quite a fair bit about growth and learning, and and forgiving yourself, I suppose, if you feel the game hasn't gone the way you want it to go, and allowing yourself to not be perfect as a GM and as a player as well. But in terms of learning, what would be something that you have recently learned yourselves, or maybe changed in your approach to pacing horror, Cat?
I think I've learned to slow down a bit, because I was somebody who would be like action point, action point, action point. Um, so it's almost kind of going, actually, yes, you can start off the scenario by throwing the players in the deep end and having something horrendous happen and go like, what do you do? But then what I would do is I'd do that, and then another thing would happen, and then another thing would happen. And I think it's slowing down and giving those real moments of silence, because I think for me, I was trying so hard to control the narrative. I wasn't giving players time to be players around the table and build relationships with their characters, because I felt like I kept needing to throw stuff at them. And that's not, I'm part of the game, but I'm not all of the game. So it was taking a step back, I think, and letting players run it a bit themselves.
And what about Rena or Lydia? Is there anything that you feel that you've changed recently, or maybe learned recently in your approach to pacing your horror games?
I think I'm still learning really about the way that different players approach a story, because some players want to drive it and to really make things happen. But other players want to sit back and wait and see what they're given before they actually start being proactive with the clues and with the plot, and to just really see where things take them. And learning to balance those two approaches. Another thing that I think I'm still working on as a keeper is, we've talked quite recently about learning to let certain things go, and learning to let certain set pieces or scenes that haven't happened yet, and learning that you can't always use those. My players recently brought the temple ceiling down on the evil zombie princess before she could do her big villain monologue, which was the first thing that I had written in the entire thing when I started making notes. And I just had to do it. I still had to do it because, I love this monologue so much. So I just had it echo in their heads as she was dying underneath the ruins of her zombie princess temple as they escaped. I don't think it was too disruptive, but I think that's something I'm still working on, is learning that not all the many copious pages of notes that I've written are going to get used. I'm just making peace with that, really. Even if it's a damn good villain monologue, it will go in the next campaign.
I think just for me, I've been learning to find the quiet moments of horror and how to play the tension in those moments. I started off with Saturday the 14th, which is big, bombastic, high tension, like high nastiness, being a slasher game, and my first few games kind of reflect that. And then when I came into like writing Jolene and then Friends of Dorothy, it's been more about when to use the different types and how to pace them, and then finding these quiet moments of horror when you can make it really personal and really intimate and really terrifying, but you don't have to drop a shoggoth on somebody. You don't have to, have this big explosion, or someone turns up dead in front of you, or whatever. Like, you have these other moments you can use, and they can be just as tense and just as intense, and they can drive the story just as much as those big moments that we all love as keepers. So that's been the thing I've been working on in my own work.
Right, right. Well, I'm just looking at the clock, and I can see that time is rapidly catching up with us. We've had a fantastic discussion this evening, this afternoon, or this morning, and I'd just like to put one final question to the table. Just quickly go round everyone and ask if you had one piece of advice that you could give a GM on trying to master horror pacing. What would it be? Kat, would you like to kick off?
Play around, play with different styles, play with different types of pacing, play with going fast and hard, play with slowing it down, and see what flavor you really enjoy and what your strength is.
Great. Rina.
I was going to say something similar is experiment. Don't box yourself in with just one type of horror or one type of storytelling. You're going to mess up. It's going to happen. You're not going to tell a fast-paced story or a slow-paced, tense story perfectly the first time or the first 5 times, 10 times, whatever. You're learning from this. And be okay with the learning process as you experiment around. Find what works for you, find what doesn't work for you. You learn just as much from what doesn't work as you do from what does.
And Lydia?
I think a good way to start thinking about how horror pacing works is to think about classic stories and how do they work. A really good one is to think about a couple of different versions of Dracula movies because they all have those same beats of the story and the moments of horror. Jonathan Harker encounters the brides, Lucy Westenra gets staked, the final battle. But how do they all approach it in different ways and thinking about how the stories actually work? How do the stories get put together? How do different directors look at different themes and what do they pull out as the biggest moment of the biggest scare in their film? There's all sorts of texts you could use for that, but I think Dracula is a really good one to look at because there's so many different versions and so many different ways and genres that it's been put into.
Well, on that note, I would like to extend a hearty thanks to our 4 panelists for joining the discussion and to their fascinating insights into how to master pacing in horror role-playing games. Let's hear from you once more, find out where people can find you and your work. Rina.
Yep, I've been Rina, pronouns they, them. You can find me on the Old Ways podcast, where I am the head of Mythos Horror, running Call of Cthulhu, Cthulhu Dark, and now a Trail of Cthulhu campaign called Silver Screams, set in 1930s Hollywood. You can also find me on Ain't Slayed Nobody in the Down Darker Trails, Bleaker Trails campaign. You can find me popping up on How We Roll, Technical Difficulties, Miskatonic Playhouse, Symphony Entertainment, and others. You can find all of my scenarios on Drive-Thru RPG, including the gold bestseller Saturday the 14th, which is today is a great day to pick that one up, folks. And you can find me on the Discord as Maverick of Mayhem.
Thank you, Rina. And Lydia?
You can find me at the Actual Play podcast, Lightless Beacons, which I co-manage. We're currently halfway through our 2nd season, and we are playing The Moonchild by the legendary Paul Fricker. And you can also find me at the Miskatonic Playhouse, where I'm a regular cast member. Most recently, I streamed A Midsummer Night's Darkness with Rina. And before that, in the long-form Cthulhu by Gaslight production, Mr. Whisper.
Thank you, Rina. And Kat.
Hi, I'm Kat. Thank you so much for letting me come and be on a panel. This is only my 2nd panel ever, so I was really scared, but it's been really lovely to speak to all of you and get to chat about horror and stuff. I'm over on Twitch as acantha_arts. I occasionally stream. I'm also a guest player on Ain't Slayed and How We Roll as well. If you want to find anything that I've written, I'm in the original Kickstarter Cthulhu Dark book. I wrote a scenario called The Doors Beyond Time, and also I wrote a setting for Arkham as well. And I'm also in the Cthulhu Hacks Mother's Love as well. I wrote a scenario in there too.
I believe I have that on the shelf behind me. And I have the Cthulhu Dark book on another one. Well, thank you all so much for being our panelists. And I'd also like to extend a very grateful thanks to Miranda, who has been working away producing behind the scenes. I have and continue to be the disconcertingly real Mr. Spike, Mike Perceval-Maxwell. That is all from us here at our panel for A Weekend with Good Friends, an online role-playing convention run by the lovely listeners of the Good Friends of Jackson Elias podcast. I hope those of you who are playing and still have more games to enjoy, enjoy the rest of the convention. And I bid you good night, and may your gods go with you.